This is Marco Reus.
This is Shinji Kagawa.
This is Nuri Shahin.
Hello, this is Jadon Sancho.
And you're listening to the Yellowwall podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 428 of the Yellowwallpod. I'm your host Stefan Butzko, and today we will talk about Borussia Dortmund's trip to Manchester, where they will face Manchester City on Wednesday night. For all that and more, joins me David Mooney from the Blue Moon podcast. Hello David, welcome to the show and welcome back.
Hello Stefan, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, but probably not as well as you are because you had a nice rest on this weekend, not playing against Tottenham, which I'm sure would have been a nice draining match because obviously Manchester City right now in the Premier League sit in second place and Tottenham right behind. Meanwhile, Dortmund had to suffer a 3-0 loss away to Leipzig, which did take a lot of wind out of Dortmund's sails ahead of this Champions League tie. So let's talk about it because there are a lot of things to discuss. For example, that Manchester City have 4 ex-Dortmund players, with Erling Haaland obviously being the most prominent at the moment. But first things first, Manchester City are leading Group G after pounding Sevilla 4-0. In Sevilla, which is something I think Dortmund fans did appreciate because Sevilla obviously their main rival for that second spot in Group G, and thus Sevilla must lose twice to Manchester City, while Dortmund are hoping to steal a cheeky point here or there. So, David, there are a lot of questions, and obviously I'm leading with the Dortmund perspective, which is how has Pep Guardiola integrated Erling Haaland into his system, because that was the big question of him going to Manchester. How would that work? How did the setup, if at all, even change?
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of angle, I think, on this one, because if you go back to 2016 when Guardiola first arrived at City, he had Sergio Aguero as the number 9 and the main centre forward. And there was a lot of talk about whether Aguero did enough away from scoring goals. Now, Aguero's goal record was ridiculously good. And so it sounds really daft to say he doesn't do enough in games. But there was a game that City played a couple of years before that. They played Guardiola's Bayern Munich at the Etihad. And City scored first. They went 1-0 up and Bayern went down to 10 men. And then, as is the way with the Guardiola team, they took control of the tie and they bossed it. City ended up going 2-1 down, and Aguero ended up scoring a hat-trick for City to win 3-2 in the final minutes of the game. And after that game, Guardiola and his assistant at the time, Dominic Torrent, said, they talked about what Aguero was bringing to City and what he was doing, and they were like, well, he needs to do more than just score a hat-trick. If he touches the ball 4 times and scores 3 of them, then he needs to get involved with the play a little bit more. And so when Haaland signed last summer, I was expecting the same sort of thing. I was expecting it to be a case of he's going to have to adapt a lot to how Guardiola will want him to play as the number 9 of a City team. And he'll probably score a lot of goals in the meantime, and we'll all sit there in press conferences saying to Guardiola, what more can he do? And Guardiola will say, well, he needs to work on this, this, and this, and this. And we all look at Guardiola as if he's mad because he keeps scoring all these goals. But weirdly, I actually think Guardiola's done the opposite. I don't think Guardiola cares that much that he's not dropping deep and getting involved in the build-up. And that's largely because Haaland's goal record so far is... I mean, it's early days, but it's on course to be better than Aguero's was. Aguero in Aguero's first, they had going into City's game against Nottingham Forest. Aguero and Haaland had exactly the same kind of opening to their City careers, except in that game, Haaland scored a hat-trick when Aguero scored a brace in what was in kind of what would have been, I think, their 7th game, and. It just shows that whatever Haaland is bringing is enough, and Guardiola won't care if he has 10 touches in an entire game. If 3 of them go in the net and he gets an assist for another one, and he's causing problems. And I think I do think it's changed how City play a little bit. I don't think City have had control of games this season as much as they have in previous seasons. And I think a large part of that is down to the fact that Haaland is being allowed to just kind of roam the top of the pitch instead of having to come back and kind of be a part of the build-up as Aguero did.
Yeah, very interesting. Obviously, I was invited to the BBC. I don't know which podcast it was, but it certainly did talk about Erling Haaland, and I was asked, if I think he would struggle, and I was like, no, he's gonna do better at Manchester because he has Kevin De Bruyne and others around him than he did at Dortmund. And right now he has scored 10 goals in 6 games, and even more ridiculous, his per 90 average is 1.87, which is just crazy. So the Dortmund average, I think, was somewhere. Well, it was above 1, which is already world class, obviously. But now it's closer to 2. And in the Champions League, I think it is above 2 because he did score twice and did not play for the entire 90 minutes. So, we obviously all know that he really has, hit the ground running. And the only...
It's a very small sample size, though, isn't it?
It is. Yes.
It's we kind of see where he is when he's played, I don't know, 100 games or whatever instead of 10. But here we are.
Yeah, obviously, but can only talk about what happened so far.
True. Yeah.
But the real question mark is obviously if he can stay healthy or not. So having a break during the week is obviously a big benefactor, but obviously Manchester City are not just Erling Haaland. So I'm asking this everyone, and I think a lot of listeners do have a rough idea of who Manchester City are because they're, after all, I think the most valuable team in the world right now, sitting, I think, according to Transfermarkt, somewhere above 1 billion euros, which is just quite ridiculous. So you can make the argument that the royal family of the UAE has given Manchester City quite a bigger advantage that the British royal family has done over the weekend. Nevertheless, what are their strengths and what are their weaknesses? Maybe starting with the strengths and style of play first.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure this season because it's only in the last couple of games where they've really started to put a 90 minutes performance together. Earlier in the season, I mean, you start making excuses here, there, and everywhere when you say things like, "Well, they had a tough kind of 20-minute spell against Aston Villa," or Newcastle have been an interesting proposition this season. That was a tough kind of 40 minutes in the middle of the game. But these are spells that City have to deal with, and they're spells that I've not been 100% convinced with them when they've dealt with them. I mean, in fairness, they came out of both of those games with a point. Perhaps a little bit fortunate too in places, but equally perhaps a little bit unfortunate not to have won the games in question. So it's a really kind of difficult one to judge this season. I mean, the most obvious strengths are the strengths that listeners will know about from City from the last 4, 5, 6 years under Guardiola. They move the ball quickly. They are able to kind of force overloads in various areas of the pitch. They like to switch it across the pitch quickly to force an overload on the opposite flank. And, weirdly, one of the weaknesses up until Haaland arrived has been actually finishing chances. One of the biggest weaknesses last season was they would get into positions where you would think, well, this is obviously a goal, and then somehow manage to try and find that extra pass that then ends up with somebody putting it wide or over the bar, or the goalkeeper makes a save. And they just weren't putting the ball in the net, sometimes when they absolutely should have done. The vast majority of games that didn't matter because then 10 minutes later somebody else came along and actually did put the ball in the net. These days Haaland tends to do it when they need to. The press around him after the Community Shield game against Liverpool was like, looking back on it retrospectively, it's really funny. Because it seemed really quick for people to judge that he's going to need a lot of time to adapt to life in England, isn't he? Because he missed he missed a couple of good chances in that game. He missed a one-on-one, and he missed there was a cross into the box that he should have gone with his right foot, and he went with his left foot and ended up putting it over the bar. And it was almost like, well, these sorts of things don't get punished in Germany, and they get punished in England. It's like, how snobby can you be? Because they clearly do get punished in Germany, and it's like the German league is not some backwater division that is not that is gone and bullied around. It's a decent standard. And then a fortnight later he's bagging a couple of hat tricks against. I actually forget the first one, but the second one was against Forest. And like all of a sudden it's look at how quickly Haaland settled into this team. So one of the strengths that they've got this season is that they seem to be able to score a lot easier out of nothing. And so keeping them quiet seems to be a pretty difficult task. In terms of weaknesses, I do worry about the defence a little bit. They obviously they went out and signed a Kanji late on in the window. Part of that down, I think, simply to the fact that Laporte is a long way from coming back. He's just started full training again now, so he's getting there, but he's probably still another month away before he can actually play properly. Ake has really struggled with injuries. He was starting the season really well and then got himself an injury and is now fighting his way back from that. And then that kind of leaves you with Stones and Diaz, who, as much as we love them, Stones knows that there is there is always a dip in form around the corner for John Stones. He could always end up really struggling at a time. And Diaz has struggled a little bit with injuries lately as well. So all of that in mind, they went out, they got Akanji to kind of come in and deputise. Then the two fullbacks, again, it feels like they've gone into this season vastly underprepared at fullback. They got rid of Zinchenko, who, by all intents and purposes, didn't want to leave. Cancelo is great at left back, but we know that Kyle Walker performs better at right back when he's got competition. And suddenly, if Cancelo's having to play left back every week, then Walker doesn't have that competition. Walker's also being asked to do something that hasn't been part of his game, and kind of tuck in and become a holding midfielder, which it feels like the wrong thing to do for Kyle Walker, because it doesn't play up to his strengths, where weirdly it does play up to the strengths of Zinchenko, who you've just sold this summer. So it just felt like a really kind of odd situation. Then obviously Sergio Gomez came in and kind of occupied that left back berth against Sevilla. He was originally a kind of developmental signing. He wasn't expected to be as involved in the first team as he might have to be now that they didn't go out and get a left back. So I just worry a little bit that the defence is a little bit on its day. It's fine, but kind of any day could suddenly not be its day anymore, and like the wheels could just fall off at any given moment, and that's when City might start to have a problem.
Yeah, if I look at your lineup against Sevilla, you had Cancelo starting as right back, at least if I'm informed correctly here, and then you had Gomez as a left back, and then Diaz and Akanji. So my question obviously has to be, first and foremost, what were your first impressions of Akanji? Because obviously Borussia Dortmund fans were very happy that he found a suitor very late in the window, because the club are obviously desperate for that transfer money. Otherwise, it would have been quite tricky for their bottom line going forward.
Yeah, I think it sounds a funny one, because it feels like City have got him quite cheaply.
They did,
because he looked like he looked like he'd settled as quickly as you possibly could after 4 or 5 days of training and being thrown into a Pep Guardiola team. He did perfectly fine. He didn't kind of set the world on fire, but then again, I suspect that was part of the game plan. I don't think he went in there to set the world on fire. I think he went in there to make sure he made no mistakes and make sure that kind of he just hit the ground running in this City team. And there was only positive impressions of him. I think he did really well with what he had to do. And so I kind of wonder if in all of this it's kind of a deal that everybody's going to be happy with. Akanji's got his move to away from Dortmund and will maybe not play as much football as he would have done at other clubs, because obviously City have the 5 centre backs when they're all fit. but he was able to seal that transfer that he wanted. Dortmund got the money, well, maybe not the money that they wanted, but some money at least. And City got a fairly decent player quite cheaply. So I think in a way everybody's happy. I think he did really well.
So when you talk about weaknesses, all I heard is you talking more about individual players. But are there structural weaknesses that Manchester City have? Do they get beaten when their pressing isn't on point, or do they suffer from set piece goals like Dortmund occasionally do?
Set pieces is a weird one, actually, because last season City had the best record in the Premier League of defending set pieces, and then I think they went all season and only conceded one from a free kick or corner.
That's ridiculous.
And then this season, I mean, they conceded 2 in 20 minutes against Crystal Palace. So it feels like that kind of that the set piece thing they're maybe not as strong as they were previously. But I'm not seeing a particular trend just yet. Nothing to be overly alarmed at. City tend to when City get beat, it tends to be this kind of this pattern of the pressing wasn't up to standard at the top end of the pitch, or the opposition didn't fall foul of it. So City, basically the opposition were perfect. They passed their way through it when they really needed to. And what the kind of knock-on effect for that is then it forces City into defending 1v1 at the back. So you end up with, let's take the Newcastle game for instance. You end up with runners running straight at John Stones or Ruben Dias, and by and large it's fine. Like defenders in Guardiola teams expect to be defending one-on-one quite a lot. But sometimes it just you get a good move, or defender slips or whatever, and you create a chance like that. So when it comes down to the games that City really struggling, they struggled against Newcastle because they were counter pressed really effectively. Newcastle were brave. They had fast players, and they kept putting them on the players that were kind of just alleviating pressure in the middle of the pitch. So a Newcastle attack would break down, and City would try and get down the other end. And the one thing City do not want in these sorts of games is a basketball game. They don't want a game where you attack, we attack, you attack, we attack. Because what happens when that happens is invariably City don't score their chances because they're, as I said before, they get into good positions and then fluff the lines, or it always feels like City underperform their expected goals, if that makes sense. Whereas the opposition, they come along and it's very much a case of we have to take our chances, and so we do. City have it's a meme among City fans that when City lose games, it's City shots 35, shots on target 15, goals none. The opposition shots 1 on target, 1 goal, and it's kind of a meme because it's kind of true. That's where City fall down sometimes, and the biggest issue that I've seen City face for a long time came this season, and that was when Alan Saint-Maximin was basically running at Kyle Walker, who was tucked into as an inverted fullback, getting past him, and then running at John Stones and Ruben Dias, because City was suddenly defending with a back two, and it resulted in at least 2 of the goals from Newcastle came about through basically Alan Saint-Maximin getting the ball at his feet and running at defenders. So I don't know if that's specifically a structural weakness. I think a lot of fans would like to see Guardiola ditch the idea of having Kyle Walker as an inverted fullback. I think the irony is that the player better suited to doing that from the right-hand side would probably be João Cancelo, but he's needed out on the left-hand side to be able to, since they sold Zinchenko, and to make sure that they didn't have to rely on Gomez. So I don't know. I think the system, the setup is okay. I think they're still learning how to play with this way of having one or both of the fullbacks come into the middle and make a midfield 3 with Rodri. But I don't know. I don't know if Guardiola will continue to do that against teams as strong as the likes of Dortmund, for instance. It might work fine when you go away to West Ham on the opening day of the season and they're not expecting it. It might work fine when you're playing Bournemouth at home. You know, it didn't work against Newcastle at St James's Park. It didn't really work against Aston Villa at Villa Park. So, you know, you suddenly start to throw in teams that are Champions League quality, and you know, it might not work again there either.
Well, we'll see about that. Especially, I would be very intrigued if Borussia Dortmund were clinical in front of goal, because that has been obviously since losing Haaland, but also just structurally been a major thorn, because Dortmund so far in the Bundesliga, I think, have only scored 8 goals. So the scoring output really has hampered them so far. They have in some games created a load of chances, but not been able to finish, or in others just outright not created anything, like in the 3-0 loss against Leipzig. So the good news for Dortmund is that Daniel Mahlen and Karim Adeyemi did travel with the team to Manchester, who were obviously out for several weeks now. Adeyemi with a toe injury and Daniel Mahlen with muscular injury. So I do not know if they could start or not, but it would obviously be helpful, because Alan Saint-Maximums, and I watched the game against Newcastle because it was good fun, very entertaining. His main strength, among many other things, is obviously the pace, and that is what Dortmund entirely lacks against Leipzig. Marius Wolf, as an attacking midfielder, did not have the dynamic really to trouble Leipzig, and Marco Reus and Julian Brandt, everyone knows, are very capable players, but pace is not really in their arsenal. So I'm really hoping that Dortmund can increase their depth and with that pace, because that is probably the one weapon that they could potentially use against Manchester City. I remember what year was it? Was it 2011 or 2012 when Dortmund got a tie away to Manchester City and were mostly the better team?
Mostly the better team. You battered us for 85 minutes and we scored a penalty at the end.
Yeah. Okay, we're outright the better team. When Jürgen Klopp, I think he fielded a 4-3-3 system, and he had a lot of pace. Obviously Jakub Blaszczykowski and Marco Reus back then, because then he still was very pacey, and that worked out quite well. Now that's obviously years ago. However, I still think it is worth mentioning that Borussia Dortmund did plan their squad to be very pacey, but due to injuries right now they cannot replicate it. So I'm wondering if they finally can do it against Manchester City, because I assume that Dortmund will mostly play on the counter-attack. That is Edin Terzic's preferred style anyway. Right now, there are instances against other teams, say Copenhagen, where the roles are a bit different, and Dortmund do press very aggressively, but I'm not entirely sure if they will do that against Manchester City. But that all being said, the last time these two sides met in the quarterfinals also had Edin Terzic on the sideline, and I would say that Dortmund did quite well in those two games. Also were a bit unlucky with refereeing calls and the fact that Emre Can is a very error prone. I'm not entirely sure if he's going to play this time around or not. He is certainly available, and Dortmund probably need to rotate again, because the most important game of the season is right after the Manchester City game, which is of course the Revier Derby against Schalke, and it's a home match, so you must not drop points against Schalke. So from that perspective, I don't know if Dortmund want to plan ahead. Probably not, considering that Champions League football is also very important to them. But this is sort of what Dortmund have to offer, and they obviously have to hope that Jude Bellingham can pull out another world-class performance. It didn't quite come up for him against Leipzig, but everyone is feeling their legs already. So what, if you look at this Dortmund team, what concerns you the most from a Manchester City perspective? Just to hear if there are any concerns about this Dortmund team right now.
It is Bellingham more than anything else, I think. It's weird. I watched back this morning the two legs of the quarterfinal from a couple of years ago, and Bellingham at the Etihad, Bellingham should have had a goal. There was a moment where he tackled Ederson and the referee gave a free kick and it just wasn't a foul. And weirdly, had he allowed play to go on and let Bellingham score and then given the free kick, I reckon the VAR would have overturned it. But because he stopped the game,
yes,
City got away with that one.
That's exactly what happened. Very frustrating.
And then I think Bellingham, I can't remember now off the top of my head, but I think he was involved in the goal that would be the equaliser in that leg for Dortmund just before City scored right at the end. I think he knocked it into Haaland, who basically held off John Stones for a bit, and then I think he flicked it round to Royce, was it, who scored? It's a while ago, I've forgotten. And then in the away leg, Bellingham scored a belter anyway, and City were on the ropes for a little bit in that game until, as you say, Anre Can stuck his arm out needlessly for a cross and gifted a way back in. So, like, Bellingham does scare me a little bit. I've got a friend who's a Birmingham City fan, and kind of when we first talked about Bellingham moving to Borussia Dortmund, he was like, "Yeah, this kid who is gonna be one of the shining lights of world football in years to come." And I was like, "But I don't understand why Borussia Dortmund are going after a teenager from a championship side, a struggling championship side." I don't see how he makes that step up and kind of does it immediately. In the years that he's been there, like, his development has been fantastic. He has turned into. I mean, he obviously, when he arrived, was already a pretty decent player, but when while he's been there, he has just turned into an absolutely solid and spectacular midfielder. And yeah, I don't know a whole lot about how Dortmund are going to set up for this game and how they're going to play. I do know that if City are going to get a result, they're going to need to keep Bellingham quiet for the 90 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about the setup from my perspective, since this is, after all, a Dortmund podcast, and I don't think you can provide too much insight. But if it were up to me, and I think what I'm going to say is going to shock a lot of my listeners, but I would actually play Emre Can in this game. I would once again set it up with a 4-3-3 system, because I think this is what is needed, and then you would have a midfield three of Özcan, Can and Bellingham. I think this would suit Dortmund a little bit better if they are playing on the counterattack, just to have a bit more let's say ball winning capabilities in the center of the field, and of course also to tighten it and have one of the defensive midfielders drop in between the center back line if necessary, because I think Dortmund will suffer a lot of low block pressure, if you will. So from that perspective, this is sort of what I would do, and then I would not play Anthony Modeste at all. He right now is Dortmund's very much struggling striker, and he is not very involved in Dortmund's play whatsoever, and I don't think you can afford that detriment really to your team. You need someone who is a bit more involved, so I would play Adeyemi, Malen and Royce up front if they are available, and if not, it has to be Julian Brandt, who at least in theory has the wits to play decent possession football and keep the ball away from Manchester City for a bit, because let's face it, having possession against Pep Guardiola team is usually very hard, and is also necessary to recover from the non-possession periods. So this is sort of what I hope Dortmund can achieve and pull off, but it's obviously going to be very tough on them to do that, because Dortmund do struggle here and there, and I'm not entirely sure if they have the energy level, which it's really what did them in against Leipzig. It's not that all of a sudden they forgot or unlearned how to play football. It's just they are already tired, and the game every 3 day rhythm has just only started.
Yeah, that's what one of the areas where I think City have been weakest this season is against teams that stop them doing. I mean, Guardiola has a phrase that he uses all the time. That is, he always says, "We need 1,000 million passes," and what he means is get the ball and not just keep possession, because Guardiola, like I always think Guardiola must hate the phrase tiki-taka, because what his teams do is not just knock the ball around in tight areas for no reason whatsoever. The point is to move the opposition out of position all the time, and so when he says we need 1,000 million passes, what he means is get the ball towards the opposition goal, keep it in their half, and move them around, and and cause somebody to lose concentration and create a gap or something like that. And the times when City have struggled this season, it's been when they haven't been able to do that. They haven't been able to put that string of 30, 40, 50 passes together that, sure, might not create a goal, but it might create a good opportunity to get the opposition on the back foot. And I think of, especially the Newcastle and the Villa game, those two matches in particular, there were spells where the opposition were knocking it around, and again, not putting huge strings of passes together, but City not being able to get into that rhythm meant it was much more of an end-to-end game than Guardiola would want it to be. So I always wonder when it comes to these sorts of games, because obviously the opposition in Dortmund are, I would rank Dortmund as a better team than both Newcastle and Villa, who are the two teams that I think have caused City the most problems this season. So I don't go into this expecting Dortmund not to cause City problems. There's the other phrase that Guardiola uses all the time is we have to suffer. We have to suffer in those moments. And again, what he means is you have to accept the pressure. You have to accept that at some point the other team will put you under pressure, and it's how you deal with that. By and large, City in the last few years, 2019-20 aside, they've coped with that pressure pretty well. And it's a case of just basically not losing your head when the opposition have got the tails up. They did that. They fought, that's how they fought back into the game against Newcastle. And that's how they ended up to basically not losing the game against Villa, by accepting the pressure, accepting that they were on the back foot, and trying to work a way to get those passes going again, take control of the game and move higher up the pitch. So if Dortmund come to the Etihad on Wednesday and they are they push high up and try and press City, but also keep a very good and solid shape, it could be quite an interesting way. It could be quite an interesting game to see how City try and do that 1,000 million passes to take control of it and kind of force Dortmund back. Sevilla, I didn't think Sevilla were. They weren't great, but they weren't that bad in the in the first half, especially against City. And it was only when the game opened up towards the end that City were able to get a few goals. But there was a few spells where, okay, Sevilla didn't actually threaten City's goal, but they were able to knock City out of the rhythm, and they were able to just not let them get into that kind of passing rhythm. And that happens for 20 minutes or so, and the fans start going, this isn't a good performance so far, and they need to book their ideas up if they're going to change it. And so I wonder if actually that game being away from home helped, because it wasn't that feeling coming from the away fans. There's only a couple of thousand of them. From the home fans, it's suddenly a lot. There's suddenly a lot more pressure there. So it will be interesting to see how both teams approach it.
Yeah, can you give me a scoreline prediction?
I'm rubbish at these, which
fine.
is why I never get I never leave myself the chance to do it on Blue Moon. I don't know. I'm going to say that I think it'll be a really, really tight game, and I think City will just edge it 2-1, like in that quarter-final a few years ago.
Well, that would be great, actually, for Dortmund, because goal difference and whatnot. But I'm actually not as optimistic, really. For the first time, I'm really thinking that Dortmund do not have what it takes to go up against Manchester City, because they're already running on fumes, and obviously that could also mean that they're inconsistent. Maybe they bring what they need to bring against Manchester City, but then in the league look a little lackluster. That can obviously happen, and for a Champions League night, you almost have to hope for. But also, they're missing Gregor Kobel, who is a massive difference maker against Leipzig. You could already see that Alex Meyer struggled a little bit. The first corner that Dortmund did concede probably was savable, and so with that in mind, I actually do think that especially Erling Haaland being more motivated than ever probably will get a couple of goals here and there, and Kevin De Bruyne, Phil Foden and such And of course, Ilkay Gündoğan are also around, so the depth is incredible. And especially in the later phases of the game, I think Dortmund will suffer a lot. So I'm predicting a 4-1 win to Manchester City if I'm realistic about it.
Would very much take that.
All right, David. Thank you so much for your time. That is it for us for this. Well, it's not for this week because we will obviously be back with a more regular episode on Thursday. But with our Champions League preview, that is it. David, thank you so much for your time. Please tell our listeners if they want to hear more of a Manchester City perspective, where they can do that.
Yes, I do Blue Moon podcast, which if you stick it into Google, you'll find it wherever you get your podcasts in that old line that has become a catchphrase for all of us podcasters these days. And I do the Athletic podcast Why Always Us as well. So if you're not bored by me wanging on about City, then there's about 2 hours of City radio there every week.
Yeah, that is very awesome. So thank you again for your time, and everyone else out there, thank you for listening. Until next time, goodbye.